Hey, what's up everybody? This is Superbrick501 and today I want to go over what I think is one of the strongest builds currently in Destiny 2, the Arc 3.0 Titan. Now as of recording this video, the current Nightfall has acute arc burn, so you deal more arc damage, and lightning crystals, so arc and stasis abilities recharge faster. And with these two modifiers mixed with this build, on a master difficulty, this build is so strong that it feels like you're playing hero or lower difficulty, because you can pretty much fully complete this Nightfall with just throwing grenades on master difficulty. This build is so incredibly strong with modifiers like this that you legitimately can go through this Nightfall with shooting probably one magazine or less out of any weapon. Now to start off with our subclass build, we're using Thunder Crash, massive burst damage super. For our class ability, we're using Thruster, mainly because this has a lower cooldown than either of your barricades, but also with how low our cooldowns are, this does give us some pretty decent movement increases. You can use whatever you want for your movement ability. For a melee, we're using Thunderclap, just a charged up frontal cone AoE melee, and this also does really high damage, so even using this charged up against a champion is going to chunk a champion's health. Really good for clearing out big packs of enemies, and will also give you healing from other parts of our build. And then we have Storm Grenade. This is probably the most important part of this build. This is where a ton of your damage comes from, and this thing is so ridiculously OP. This is easily the strongest grenade in the game in this build. Then for our aspects, we're using Touch of Thunder. This is also another thing that makes this build what it is, because for Storm Grenade, it causes it to, after detonating, it creates a roaming thundercloud that tracks enemies dealing damage to them. So essentially you just create this little thundercloud that roams around following enemies. And with some other parts of this build, Storm Grenade can last upwards of like 20 seconds. Absolutely ridiculous. Then we have Knockout, causes us to heal off of our melee defeating enemies, and buffs up our melee range and damage from breaking shields. For our fragments, we're using Spark of Shock. Your grenades now jolt targets. You're going to be spamming out grenades, going to deal a ton more damage. Jolt targets also create ionic traces from those jolt targets. Then we have Spark of Magnitude. Lingering grenades last longer, so our Storm Grenade is going to last even longer. Using Spark of Resistance. When surrounded, you're more resistant, plus 10 strength. Mainly using this just to become more tanky when surrounded. Then Spark of Ions. Defeating a jolted target creates an ionic trace. And again, our grenade's going to be jolting enemies, so we're going to be creating ionic traces off of our grenades, giving us more ability energy. Now for stats, you're going to want to get 100 resilience and then get as high as you can in discipline. I currently have 100 resilience and really high discipline and really high recovery. Those are always going to be three really good stats, especially on the Titan, but primarily you want resilience and discipline as high as you can get them. For our exotic armor piece, we're using Hearts of Inmost Light. This is just so strong for this build. Now what this exotic does is using one of your abilities empowers the other two. So if you use your class ability, it empowers your grenades and your melee abilities. And if you use your grenade ability, it empowers your melee and your barricade. Now empowering these abilities mean they recharge much faster, and grenades and melee do more damage. They both stack up 2 times. So with this build, you will constantly be having really high ability recharge. Pretty much everything in this build is focused around all 3 of our abilities coming back super quickly, so you can keep your empower stacks from Inmost Light constantly up. And this is just going to allow you to spam out all of your abilities. So you're going to want your helm on solar, so you can use 2 Ashes to Assets mods, which gives you bonus super energy on grenade kills. You're getting tons of grenade kills. You're going to be getting your super back pretty quickly, which is just going to add a massive amount of damage to this build. Then we're using Bountiful Wells. Now this allows your well mods to stack, which depending on how many of those mods you're using will spawn additional elemental wells. So we're using 1 Bountiful Wells mod with 2 elemental ordnance mods, which when we get a grenade kill will spawn 3 elemental wells, which will give us a lot of ability energy back. Now the spawning of these wells does have some amount of internal cooldown, but because of how long our grenades last and the fact that they track enemies, you will actually be able to proc this multiple times, sometimes even up to 3 times per grenade. So that is 3 to 9 elemental well spawns for throwing out 1 grenade. That's absolutely ridiculous. Gonna give you back a ton of ability energy. For our gauntlets, you're gonna want Font of Might. Since we're spawning so many elemental wells, we're gonna get a damage boost to any arc weapons we're using. Then if you're doing any hard content, you can use whatever anti-champion mods you want, and that's primarily what the other mod slots are gonna be for on your gauntlets. For your chest piece, you're gonna be using an elemental elemental ordnance, and then I would recommend just 2 thermoshock platings. If you want to change this up, you can use whatever other defensive mods you want. You can use concussive dampener, you can use sniper damage resistance, but for general play, 2 thermoshock platings is going to be a really big buff to your survivability. Then for our leg armor, we're going to be using another elemental ordnance, and then for the other mods, you can use pretty much whatever you want. I'm using machine gun scavenger because I am using a machine gun a lot of the time, especially for higher difficulty content to counter overload champions. Then I have an absolution mod on, so reduce all your cooldowns when you pick up auras of power. Primarily, this is going to be for when you're playing with other players who are going to be creating auras of power. Reduces your cooldowns even more when picking those up. But for these 2 mods, you can switch them around however you want. Primarily, you just need elemental ordnance. Then for our Titan mark, this is one of the most important parts of the build, and that is because you're going to want to use lightning strikes twice. Now what this does is after throwing an arc grenade, you gain increased grenade recharge time for a short time, and arc final blows extend the duration of this effect. Now this is one of the big reasons why we can have grenades out for like 20 seconds. We throw out a grenade, we get additional grenade recharge for our next grenade. This thing is roaming around killing stuff, extending itself, and any other arc damage you're dealing and getting final blows with is also going to extend this. So just absolutely ridiculous. And the grenade tracking is really a massive part of this build, because if you just throw one grenade down, enemies are going to move away, so that grenade staying there for 20 seconds wouldn't necessarily be that good, but our grenade just tracks enemies, so the longer it stays out, the more things it's going to kill. And you do have 2 other really good options for this. You can also drop down your stat mod to 1, so you can put on another 2-point mod. Now if you're doing harder content with overload champions, I massively recommend surge detonators. This causes your grenade to counter overload champions. It's incredibly strong and makes dealing with overload champions a breeze. But if you're not going against overload champions or playing lower difficulty content, you can take off surge detonators and you could put on seeking wells if you want. This will make all those wells you spawn move towards you on the ground, so you don't have to go over to pick them up. They'll come to you kind of like ionic traces do. But personally, I don't see a big issue with this, especially with how fast you are with amplified. I don't have an issue ever picking up my wells, so I pretty much just keep surge detonators on. This mod is also incredibly strong and I think pretty underrated for arc builds. And with how strong this build is, just with its abilities and armor mods, you have a lot of options for what you want to use as weapons. Now currently with this week's Nightfall and a lot of other activities being anti-barrier and anti-overload, I'm using an auto rifle. I'm using duty bound right now, actually a really good auto rifle from this week's Nightfall, but just any auto rifle is going to be good. I've been using the Cold Heart quite a bit. This thing is incredibly strong, and what this does is the longer you're shooting on a target, it charges up to do more and more damage, but then when you're in its high damage state, which you can get just by charging it up, say on a boss or a tanky enemy, it'll randomly generate ionic traces, which is giving you more ability energy. And in 100 round magazines, say using this on a boss, you can sometimes generate like 3 or 4 ionic traces. Incredibly strong, really good damage for any content you're going to want to do. And then I'm just using whatever legendary LMG because I am using anti-overload on LMGs. Now you don't necessarily need this because with how many grenades we have and using surge detonators that already counter overload, you could potentially just counter overload champions with your grenades. It's so nice to have a machine gun just in case your grenade doesn't counter the overload champion by itself. But again, you can use whatever else you want to use. Risk runners are really good, especially for lower difficulty content. Delicate Tomb is actually incredibly strong and will also create more ionic traces and jolt targets. Trespasser's pretty good. Any other arc weapon, if you want a arc auto rifle, you could use Come to Pass, get one of these crafted, really good against champion enemies. But this build is just incredibly flexible with the weapons you're going to be using. But that's pretty much all I want to go over with this build. So subscribe if you want to see more Destiny 2 or other FPS videos. Leave a like if you liked the video. Leave a comment down below what you guys think about this Titan Arc 3.0 build, and thanks for watching.